Good afternoon, class. Checking back in, and I've had a little change of mind. Rather than record a screencast for last Friday's lecture talking about the expansion of roads, I've decided instead to move on and cover a little further of the information that we started today, and the terms and concepts from Friday's lecture are taken quite closely from the essay that we read for last Friday. So if you are unclear when you look at your review guide of different terms and concepts that are from that article, you'll be able to find just by checking in with that article. You'll have a better sense of those terms, and of course I'm willing to help you at office hours or what have you if you have leftover questions as well. So instead I'm just going to continue on with what we were talking about today so that I can get us to our discussion of conservation and preservation, which will be something that we'll be carrying through much of the remainder of our week together. And I just want to start here to point out that we're really looking at how the way in which the United States government chose to dispose of its lands, its vast public domain, during the 1800s and 1900s, it really did involve issues of race, class, and gender, particularly race and class, probably class more than anything. But nonetheless, these are going to play powerful roles. And I'm just going to click through these slides, and if you needed to include anything that we covered earlier, you can stop and, of course, record and freshen up your notes a little bit if you need to. So we left off here, and I don't know, I wasn't doing a very effective job of explaining this, but this becomes a plat system, the system of putting together a township and range system where different tracts of land are divided up into sections, and this becomes very much a part of our, the way in which we sort of think about our land and the way we write up deeds for property into the present. I think someone in class was referencing that when they worked in a law office, maybe it was Julian, that they saw this evidence of township and range references. So essentially it's a system that works from east to west, which makes sense because that was the pattern of settlement. And what we're looking at here is in this given township is essentially something that measures the north to south extent of a land parcel, and then the range heads east to west. Sorry, my mouse isn't cooperating. So what this means is each section can be located within a certain township, which is a north-south measure, and within a certain range, which is an east-west measure. This is a little bit like, determining your location by latitude and longitude. And essentially your parcel, so every township and range measurement would then also set aside a parcel. It was a parcel, I can't remember which one it was like 15 or 16. It was usually a section that was in the middle of that township and range, and that land would be set aside for helping the people of that area arrange for a public school system. Now, it didn't mean that the school would necessarily be built there, but that land was to be used for the purposes of serving public education. So, for example, you could sell that land, the community could, and they could use the proceeds to build a school somewhere else within that area. And it's also worth noting that each of these sections is a mile, it's a square mile. So for this township and range piece, we're looking at essentially a 6 mile by 6 mile section. So that gives you a sense. If you own a section, you essentially own a square mile of land. That's a pretty vast tract. And if you own a quarter of a section, okay, so say over here you own this, you're essentially owning a quarter of a square mile. Again, a pretty vast, 160 acres, nothing to sneeze at. So anyway, this is important for understanding the system that our essentially founding fathers used to help them in the dissemination of land. Now, the way this worked was always, as I've suggested in our objectives, it was subject to class concerns, meaning sometimes the wealthy could game the system. And for some of you, it may seem that the well-off are able to oftentimes profit, partly through intelligence, but also sometimes through gamesmanship. But one of the ways in which this happened was, if you think of the larger context in which land distribution happened, one of the concerns that industrialists had, we know that this market economy is taking shape in the eastern, particularly along the Atlantic seaboard of the east in the United States. If you just suddenly open up and you sell land cheaply, there's some problems that can go with that. And one of them is, particularly if you're a capitalist, is what are you going to do for your pool of labor? If land is cheap and people don't have to stay on the eastern seaboard, and if they have essentially options or choices, they might choose to settle farther west and settle land. And if land is tremendously abundant, which it was at this time of expansion, then that's going to mean, according to supply and demand, that land is going to be cheap. So if you're a capitalist, this is not really a good deal, because it's tough for you to corral your labor pool that you need to profitably produce whatever widgets or whatever factory work is happening. So one of the ways that this was addressed was through the practice of high minimums. Now, land is still going to be pretty cheap, which of course will be the case when land is in tremendous abundance. But the way to offset that was to require that you could only buy land in a minimum size. So what that means is, let's say land is only $1 an acre, but I'm going to say you can't buy it for less than 100 acres at a time. That's a high minimum. It means a large minimum of land to be sold at any given one time. And what this does is it keeps the poorer members of society still in a situation where they don't have the option of buying land, because that high minimum would have been enough to dissuade them or prevent them from taking advantage of it. Also, then we'll see the phenomenon of squatting, and some of you are maybe familiar with what it means to squat. There's something called squatters' rights. Essentially, someone is squatting when they decide to live on land that they don't own. And sometimes we even see evidence of this today. Sometimes a homeless person might camp or poach on the back corner of someone's property, and hopefully they won't go noticed. There's also a body of law known as squatters' rights, which refers to if someone is effectively using a parcel of land for a long period of time, usually it's like 7 years, then that land can just essentially default to their ownership. So sometimes for landowners, they fight this by having their land surveyed to make sure that their neighbor's fence was in fact built on the boundary, because if it wasn't, 7 years goes by, that neighbor could make a claim that the strip of land that they overextended their property by is no longer available to them. So these are all issues of class that factor into the way in which land is distributed in the mid-1800s and on into the 1900s. The Log Cabin Act of 1841 legalizes squatting. So if you can prove that you've settled on land and improved it, even if it's owned by someone else, you can then retroactively purchase it, and quite cheaply. So this was a way that the authorities were trying to prevent, essentially doing some service to the wealthy, but at the same time allowing for some of that class pressure, that tension, to be addressed in the form of land policy, so that people wouldn't rise up or find themselves unduly treated by this. So the other thing that's going on here is that there's sort of the Log Cabin Act is pointing out that if you own land but you're not using it, that's not quite as noble of a purpose as someone who's actually using the land. So there are still ways that the wealthy and those who own large tracts of land could game the system. But there was an effort, it seems, that was being made to try to make sure that land is being gainfully occupied and utilized. We've talked about the Homestead Act of 1862. The Homestead Act was intended to allow people to settle, and it divided land up into 160 acre parcels. But there were still efforts for speculation, and I want to define that term. Speculation is when one owns land with no intent to use it, but just an intent to profit off it. So usually a speculator will try to buy land cheaply and then sell it expensively. The problem with this is it usually results in higher and higher land prices, and usually speculators don't utilize their land as effectively because they're just investing it. It's just an investment. It's not actually a use, and it's not a use of land in the traditional sense. So this was sometimes a problem. Commutation was a practice that was used. Essentially what would happen is people that wanted to accumulate land in the West under, say, the Homestead Act, is they would hire a homesteader to go purchase that, do the paperwork, and then after a short period of time, that homesteader would commutate, or through the process of commutation, transfer the deed over to this original investor, or I should say this person who originally intended to take over the land. And then that person would would pay the homesteader a lump sum in recognition of the work that the homesteader used to allow that property to be accumulated as part of the investors, according to the investor's original intent. And again, as you'll see here, the 12 by 14, there were instances where people would game the Homestead Act by building just really tiny structures that were intended to be quote-unquote improvements that proved up that land. Okay, here's a series of federal land acts that were designed to place land in the clutches of settlers. And you'll also notice one of the themes behind these various land acts was that they were trying to account for the fact that not all areas of the West are similar. And so we have instances where if you plant trees on grassland or a treeless plain, you receive special enticements. You'll notice that in desert areas, you could get a larger parcel of land, 640 instead of 160. The recognition there is that desert lands aren't as fruitful, and so you need more land to make things work. Say if you're going to graze cattle, you're not going to be able to get by with just 160 acres. You will need more. And then also efforts to encourage people to stake claims for minerals and to prospect and maybe find minerals of value in the American West. Okay, and with that, I will stop for today. Thanks for bearing with me. All right, bye.